Hello, boys and girls. I hope you're ready for a story. This week we will be travelling to the island of Mauritius. And for those of you who don't know, my mum was British, but my dad is actually Mauritian, so I am half Mauritian. The next time I flew, a year later, was with my dad. We went to our motherland of Mauritius. I struggled with the 12-hour flight, having not done anything nearly as long before, and at one point I fell asleep and woke up feeling so refreshed I thought I must have slept most of the boring long journey away, only to find that I'd been asleep for only 30 minutes and had the next 10 hours to go wide awake. It would take me years before I finally mastered the art of sleeping on a plane. After finally arriving, I sat in the back of a car belonging to one of my many cousins and stared out of the window, taking in all the new sights and smells of somewhere so different to home and yet a form of home to me too. From the main road, we turned off into a dirt track and passed by all different styles of houses until finally reaching my cousin's house, which was a 2-storey house with a garden and a longan tree. The housing here was nowhere near as regimented as it was in England. The houses at home tended to be much more in keeping with each other, if not identical. All made at the same time in each area and mostly terraced. Here, they were obviously all built at different times and by different people. I would assume that the people had purchased the land to build their houses on to their own specification over the years. And with such clearly varying budgets, it showed in the different styles of housing. From bricks to wood, right up to the road or with a garden space around it. Some were pretty and ornate, and some were simply functional looking. There were just as many bungalows as there were houses. We drove up the side of my cousin's house, but instead of stopping, we drove straight past it and came to a stop at a white shack at the back. I got out and was greeted by a large-built man who looked a bit like the Mauritian Elvis Presley. He hugged me tightly and kissed both of my cheeks and introduced himself as my Uncle Bertie, Tonton. He ushered me inside the shack, which rapidly I realised I was staying in, and to my further surprise, found was actually my dad's home when he was growing up with my grandparents, Grand-mère Olga and Grand-père Clément. Dad assured me that it wasn't a shack like when he was young. I thought about how alien it was to me, having grown up in a red brick terraced house on an estate. I couldn't imagine my own father living in a wooden house with no central heating or air conditioning and walls that didn't quite touch the floor. We had no money growing up, yet this seemed another level. It also occurred to me that under slightly different circumstances, there was every chance that I could have been raised here instead of England, and how different my life would have been. Not better or worse, just different. I stepped back outside to look at the moon. It was a full moon that night, and it had what looked like a rainbow all the way around it. I had never seen a moon like that and was amazed that it was the same moon we have at home. Despite being around midnight, it was still so bright and clear that you would not have needed a torch under that moonlight. I felt a few splodges of rain on me and was shocked at the fact that it could rain on such a warm night. I didn't rush inside like I normally would if it was raining though, as I found that the heavy downpour was like a warm shower and actually quite welcome and refreshing against the heat. Tonton Bertie looked at me like I was mad for standing out in the rain staring at the moon and called me in to send me to bed. The next few days I spent getting to know my numerous cousins, getting up to all the things that teenagers do in any country. Sleepovers, discos, talking about clothes and our body parts that we hate, the girls crushing on boys, the boys crushing on girls, and music. The only real difference was that my cousins spoke 2 languages fluently instead of just English, and they spent their days off school in the warm turquoise sea surrounded by coral reef and tropical fish, rather than the cold and muddy local river in welly boots catching little fish in a bucket like me. The years spent not knowing each other quickly disappeared, and we all spent our 3 weeks hanging out and getting into mischief. They took me to see the sights too, but I never felt like a tourist with them. We went to Chamarel to see the seven-coloured earth, which is rolling hills of naturally occurring rainbow colours on the ground. We could run around in the dirt, and I even rode on a giant tortoise that roamed the area. On my most recent trip, I found that it is now all very well conserved and you cannot actually walk on the coloured mounds, and you certainly cannot ride the tortoises. But as children, we didn't think of conservation and assumed that tortoises were so strong that we wouldn't be a bother, like riding a horse. One day, as I was swimming in the sea with my cousin Rodney, it was a particular beach that has very shallow water for a very long way out to sea, the water never reaching higher than my shoulders. It started to get dark, but before we thought to head back to dry land, a large creature about a metre in length swam past me, brushing against my leg. I asked what type of fish it was, and my cousin told me not to worry, as, in fact, it was just a little baby shark. Shark? Well, that was it for me. I was convinced that a great white mother wouldn't be far behind, not knowing back then that they wouldn't be in such shallow waters anyway. And I started running back to shore in a panic, promptly forgetting all about the coral, and I cut my right knee open, which for anyone who's not cut themselves on coral before, I can assure you it is extremely painful, as the rock-hard tentacles of this living substance are razor-sharp, and it poured with blood. And being acutely aware of how sensitive sharks are to blood after watching it in documentaries, I panicked even more and jumped up into my cousin's arms and made him carry me all the way back to shore. I still have the scars from my shark attack to this day. 3 white stripes across the top of my right knee, each one around 2 inches long. Mauritius is only around the size of Surrey, the county that I'm from in England, and known as Paradise Island, being one of the biggest honeymoon destinations of all time, and in recent years topping the charts for actual weddings abroad too. It never fails to irritate me when I hear a friend say that they have been there, only to find that they've been to a resort and spent their days on the private beach watching the shows of Sega dancing put on just for them. It's such a small place, there is no reason you can't see all there is to see, even if you don't have family as tour guides. My father had a friend called Dede who lived just around the corner, and after a very uncomfortable week staying with Tonton Bertie, we went to stay with Dede and his wife Sybil. They were an elderly couple whom I grew so fond of. There is a culture over there, much like the culture we used to have in England, where you don't need to be a blood relative to be family. Growing up in the same neighbourhood was just as good. We spent many evenings talking, and they proudly took photographs of me all dressed up in the full-length dress I had had made there for my high school leavers ball in the days before the UK adopted the word prom from our friends across the pond, and for only £17.50. Dede and Sybil had a house in Rivière des Anguilles, which they took me to. I remember driving along the winding roads and looking up through the trees, with the leaves making the sun look speckly as it shone through the gaps. I really felt as though we were driving into the rainforest, having never seen a real rainforest before. Eventually, as we pulled up to the house, I looked at it in shock and excitement as I saw it. Entirely made of concrete, it had been perfectly moulded into the shape of a boat, which I quickly named Titanic. The inside was not large. A placement of furniture was awkward due to the shape of the building. But I was in love with it. It had porthole-style windows and the walls were grey, but it was still so light and airy. There were no other houses in the area that were even remotely similar, and it was actually not even right by the sea as you would expect from a house shaped as a boat. Sadly, some years after I was there this first time, the name Titanic grew to be just as haunting as the real Titanic, as I learned that one day, while Dede and Sybil were driving back from there, Dede had a seizure at the wheel and crashed the car. He ended up in a coma and awoke to find that the only woman he had ever loved had perished in the crash. Dede physically recovered, but he was never the same again, struggling to eat without his bride or sleep without her beside him. The next time I saw him, he was a shell of his former self, lonely and lost. I think it would have been much less cruel for them both to have died together. Thinking about Dede and Sybil makes me wonder if I could ever be lucky enough to find a love like theirs. Equally, though, it makes me think of how there is no real happy ending. Either you break up or one of you dies and leaves the other one broken. But at that age, while I was there, I was more concerned with new boy friends than boyfriends, and certainly not thinking about whether I would find love everlasting. I suppose back then I took it as a given that you just meet someone and it all falls into place. No teenager ever thinks of life past 21, really, let alone into their 30s. I spent some time while in Mauritius in my cousin Lewis's school. It seemed that my whole family is made up of teachers, nurses, and a few police officers thrown in for good measure. Grand-père Clément was a headmaster, and on my second trip there, I was fortunate enough to visit his school and sit at the actual desk where he used to sit at. My grandfather had died before I was even born, and so I only have one photograph to show me what he even looked like. So I valued this opportunity to feel close to him. I made lots of interesting discoveries about my family while I was out there. There was talk that Grand-père Clément had been married before, but that the wife and baby had both died in childbirth. But I visited the family graves and spotted that the baby had actually died at the age of 18 months. The cemetery itself was a fantastic discovery. It was in a place called Suitcase, which had luscious greenery and waves that crashed into the rocks and rolled away. Over the years, the cemetery itself had been eroded away, taking the graves and the bodies within away to sea. The government had decided to build a defence wall to prevent any more family graves disappearing, and just in time for my family, as they were only a few metres away from the water when the wall was built. They now lie in graves with a better view than I could ever dream of having in life. I know over the years I will visit and revisit and discover more of my family's secret history. Well, there we go. That was my first trip to Mauritius at the tender age of 16. Next week, we will be going to Ireland. I hope you are ready to come and join me there. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.